In a secluded mansion, a birthday party fades into silence and loneliness until a humble, uninvited boy knocks on the door with a smile and a heartfelt request. This simple gesture ignites the spark of a friendship that will change their lives forever. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Let's get started. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear. The mansion, perched on the highest point of Beacon Hill, seemed to challenge the Westchester sky with its imposing architecture. Massive windows reflected the Saturday afternoon sun, while the meticulously manicured garden displayed white roses that seemed to lack the courage to perfume the heavy silence. Edward Miller stood in the foyer, his hands in the pockets of his impeccably tailored grey suit jacket, observing the party room prepared with a perfection that hurt the eyes. Pink and lilac balloons formed delicate arches over the main table. The cake, a three-tiered castle masterpiece, sparkled under the soft lights. There were brownies, chocolate kisses, cupcakes decorated with cartoon characters, and a table of natural juices and sodas lined up like little soldiers in formation. The hired clown waited in a corner, adjusting his colourful wig and rehearsing juggling tricks with balls that seemed to float in slow motion. Everything was perfect, absolutely everything, and for that very reason, everything was terribly wrong. Edward felt the familiar knot tighten in his throat. It was almost 3 in the afternoon. The party had started at 2. He glanced at the Swiss watch on his wrist as if he could force time to rewind, to bring back the 28 invitations that had been sent out 3 weeks earlier. 28 children from Laura's school, 28 families that had been carefully selected, 28 RSVPs that had arrived one by one with polite, formal, empty excuses. Unavoidable commitments, trips planned for months, sudden colds, birthdays of distant cousins. The list of justifications was creative, he had to admit. But deep down, Edward knew the truth that no one dared to say out loud. Ever since the accident, it always came back to the accident. 3 years had passed, but the wound remained open, bleeding silently in the hallways of this house that was too big, too empty. He could still hear the sound of the failing brakes, Patricia's desperate voice screaming their daughter's name, the dull impact of metal against the utility pole, and then the deafening silence of the hospital, the smell of antiseptic, the doctors with their technical words trying to soften the unbearable. Spinal cord injury, paraplegia, wheelchair, rehabilitation, words that became the new vocabulary of his life, replacing the dreams of seeing Laura dance ballet, run in the garden, climb trees. Patricia couldn't handle it. Edward swallowed hard at the memory. She couldn't handle the guilt of driving that day, of not being able to avoid the crash, of seeing her daughter in that condition. She couldn't handle the pitying looks, the delicate questions, the routine of physical therapy, and endless appointments. 6 months later, she packed her bags and left for Europe, promising to return when she was stronger, when she could process it all. But Edward knew she wouldn't be back. Some people run from pain. Others like him learn to live with it, to carry it like a heavy backpack you can never take off. A soft whir of wheels on the marble floor pulled him from his thoughts. Edward turned and felt his heart clench as he saw Laura entering the party room. Susan, the caregiver who had become more family than employee, was pushing the wheelchair carefully, but it was clear Laura wanted to take control. The little girl gripped the wheels with her small hands, trying to propel herself forward with a determination that always impressed Edward. Laura was beautiful. Susan had chosen a lilac dress with white lace details, matching the balloons perfectly. Her light brown hair, long and wavy like her mother's, was tied in 2 pigtails adorned with pink ribbons. She wore a sparkling princess tiara, and on her feet white ballet flats that would never touch the ground to dance, but which she had insisted on wearing because, in her own words, every princess needs pretty shoes. Laura's eyes, those enormous brown eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of someone much older, scanned the empty room. Edward saw the hope in her face begin to flicker, like a candle about to go out. She looked at the front door, then at her father, then back at the door. She was waiting. She still believed someone would come. "Daddy, are my friends late?" Laura asked, her voice holding that careful tone of someone who already knows the answer, but refuses to accept it. Edward walked over to her, knelt beside the chair, and held her small hand in his. The words he needed to say were stuck somewhere between his heart and his throat, fighting not to come out as a sob. "Laura, my princess," he began, trying to keep his voice steady. "Sometimes people have last-minute things come up, but we're here, and we're going to make this the most special party ever, okay?" Laura nodded, but Edward saw a single tear roll down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly with the back of her hand, as if to hide her disappointment, to protect her father from her own pain. That broke Edward in a way no disastrous business meeting or stock market crash ever could. Susan approached, her eyes also glistening with unshed tears, and placed a hand on Laura's shoulder. "Let's sing Happy Birthday, sweetie. The clown is waiting to do magic tricks just for you." Laura agreed with a nod, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The clown came closer, performing exaggerated pirouettes, pulling colorful scarves from impossible places, trying to draw laughs from an audience of 3 lost in a room set for 30. He was good at his job, Edward had to admit. He made a dove appear from a top hat, turned a napkin into a rose, balanced plates while walking an imaginary tightrope. Laura clapped politely, but it was clear that each magic trick, each rehearsed joke, only highlighted the emptiness around them. When it was time to sing, Susan lit the 8 colorful candles on the chocolate castle. Edward and she sang together, their voices echoing through the huge room, getting lost in the decorated corners where the voices of 28 other children should have been. Laura closed her eyes, made a silent wish, and blew out the candles with all the strength she could muster. Edward wondered what she had wished for. Friends? Her mother back? To walk again? Or simply for this torture to end? They were just starting to cut the cake when the doorbell rang. Edward felt a wave of irrational hope. Maybe one of the families had changed their mind. Maybe someone was genuinely late and just arriving. He practically ran to the door, his heart beating faster, feeling ridiculously hopeful for a 42-year-old man who ran one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the country. But when he opened the door, he didn't find any of the families he had invited. Instead, he saw a skinny boy, about 9 or 10 years old, wearing faded denim shorts and a yellow T-shirt with a superhero logo that Edward didn't recognize. The graphic was worn, almost invisible from so many washes. The boy's sneakers were scuffed, with one lace patched up, but they were clean. His dark eyes shone with a mix of shyness and determination. And he held a small package wrapped in what was clearly reused gift paper with the creases and marks of a previous use. "Good afternoon, sir," the boy said, and Edward noticed his voice trembled slightly, but it was polite, careful. "I saw the balloons and heard there was a party. Is it someone's birthday?" Edward blinked, surprised. He looked past the boy, trying to see if there was an adult nearby, a guardian, but the boy was alone. In the distance, down at the base of the hill, Edward could see the housing project where the boy likely came from. Simple buildings, painted in faded colors, with clothes hanging on balconies and satellite dishes sprouting from the roofs like metal mushrooms. "Yes," Edward replied, still processing the situation. "It's my daughter Laura's birthday. She's turning 8. The boy smiled, and it was a genuine smile with no trace of malice or ulterior motives. "I'm 9. My name is Michael. I brought a present. It's not very big, but my grandma helped me make it." He held out the package to Edward, and it was such a simple, pure gesture that Edward felt something stir inside his chest, something that had been dormant for a long time. Edward hesitated. Part of him wanted to thank the boy politely and send him on his way, but another part remembered Laura's face when she realized no one was coming. He remembered the disappointment in her eyes, the way she had wiped away that single tear. And then, before, he could think too much about the consequences. He heard himself say, "Do you want to come in, Michael? Join the party." The boy's eyes lit up as if Edward had just offered him the entire world. "Really? Even without an invitation? Can I?" "Yes, you can," Edward replied, and as he opened the door wider, he felt as if he were opening something bigger, something he didn't yet fully understand. Michael entered the mansion with careful steps, his eyes wide as he took in every detail. The marble floor, the crystal chandelier, the art on the walls, the furniture. That looked like it was from a design magazine. Edward watched the boy's reaction and saw no envy, just pure admiration, childlike curiosity. Michael looked like he was stepping into a fairy tale castle, and his expression was that of someone who believed in magic. When they reached the party room, Laura looked up from the slice of cake Susan had just placed in front of her. Her gaze met Michael's, and Edward saw something extraordinary happen. Laura's face transformed. Her eyes sparkled. Her lips curved into a real smile, the first genuine smile in months. She dropped her fork onto the plate and propelled her chair toward the door. "Michael, it's you!" Laura exclaimed, her voice a mix of surprise and joy. "You came to my party." Edward frowned, confused. "You know him, Laura?" The girl nodded enthusiastically, her eyes fixed on the boy. "He lives down the hill, Dad. I see him sometimes from my bedroom window. One time he was flying a kite and it went so high it almost reached my window. I waved and he waved back. We've never talked, but I knew he was nice." Michael approached, still holding the now slightly crumpled gift. "I saw you up there too," he said, his voice soft and genuine. "I always wanted to meet you. When I saw the balloons, I thought maybe today was the day. Happy birthday, Laura." He held out the gift, and Laura accepted it with a reverence that made Edward's heart ache. She carefully tore the paper, revealing a simple wooden picture frame, hand-painted in vibrant colors. Inside was a colored pencil drawing of a girl in a wheelchair, floating among clouds and stars, surrounded by colorful birds. In the bottom corner, written in a childish but neat hand, it read, "For this girl who lives in the clouds." Laura held the frame to her chest, her eyes welling up. "It's the most beautiful present I've ever gotten," she whispered, and Edward knew it wasn't an exaggeration. None of the expensive toys he had bought, none of the imported dolls or video games, had ever elicited that reaction. Michael smiled, clearly relieved. "My grandma helped me with the frame. She says all art needs a nice frame. And I drew the picture thinking of you. Because you live so high up, you must be able to see everything from up there, even the clouds." "I can," Laura agreed, excited. "From my window I can see the whole city. It's like I'm flying." "That must be awesome," Michael said, and then, without hesitation, he asked, "Do you want me to push your chair? We can play race cars or spaceship or whatever you want." Edward tensed, waiting for Laura's reaction. She was sensitive about the chair, about people treating her differently, with pity or discomfort. But with Michael, it was different. He didn't look at the chair as a tragedy. He looked at it as part of her, as natural as her brown eyes or her pigtails. There was no pity there, only acceptance. "Yes," Laura replied, her voice full of enthusiasm. "Let's pretend my chair is a spaceship and we're exploring distant planets." And so, in the enormous room that moments before had felt like a mausoleum of lost hopes, two shouts of joy began to echo. Michael pushed the chair in circles, while Laura stretched her arms out like wings, shouting imaginary commands to dodge invisible asteroids. They pretended the cake was a snowy mountain on a frozen planet, that the brownies were precious meteors to be collected, that the clown was a friendly alien from a distant solar system. Edward leaned against the wall watching, feeling something warm and unfamiliar grow in his chest. Susan stood beside him, wiping away the tears that rolled freely down her face. The clown, realizing he finally had a real audience, dove into the game with renewed gusto, becoming the captain of a rival ship in a space battle where no one lost, only gained laughter. The afternoon transformed into something magical. Michael tried every treat, declaring that brownies were the best invention in human history. He and Laura created an elaborate story about two space explorers discovering lost civilizations among the stars. The chair ceased to be a limitation and became a tool for adventure, transformed by imagination into a chariot, a ship, a teleportation pod. At one point, Laura wanted to show Michael her room. Edward followed them, walking up the stairs while Susan took the chair in the elevator installed beside them. Laura's room was a universe in itself. Walls painted a soft lilac, shelves filled with books and dolls, an impressive collection of assembled and framed jigsaw puzzles in the huge window overlooking the city. Michael walked to the window, his eyes wide. Wow, you really can see everything from here. Look, I can see my building. He pointed to the housing project below, and Laura moved her chair closer to look with him. Which one is yours? She asked. The yellow one, 3rd floor, 4th window. See that blue shirt hanging out to dry? That's it. I live with my grandma, my dad, and my mom. Your family sounds nice, Laura commented, and there was a hint of melancholy in her voice that Edward recognized. It was the longing for her mother, always present, always aching. They are, Michael replied. My grandma makes the best chili in the world, and my dad's a bus driver, so he knows the whole city, and my mom's a cafeteria worker at a school. She always brings home drawings the kids make for us. That's cool, Laura said. My mom lives far away now, but my dad is always here and so is Susan. They take care of me. Your house is really big, Michael observed. Do you get lonely in here? Sometimes, Laura admitted. It's too big. Sometimes I wish it was smaller, you know. Cozier, like yours must be. Michael thought for a moment. My place is small, but it's full of love. My grandma always says a good home isn't one with a lot of space, but one with a lot of caring. Edward, listening from where he stood, felt the words strike something deep inside him. When was the last time this mansion had been filled with caring, with genuine human warmth? He worked 16 hours a day, came home exhausted, ate dinner alone in his study while reviewing reports. Laura had everything money could buy, but he had never stopped to ask if she had what money couldn't buy. Presence, connection, a real family. The sun was beginning to set when Michael finally said he had to go. Laura held his hand longer than necessary, as if afraid that if she let go, he would disappear, and everything would go back to the way it was. Will you come back, Michael? Will you be my real friend? She asked, and the vulnerability in her question was like a knife in Edward's chest. I'll be back, Michael promised, his tone serious. Real friends don't disappear. My grandma always says friendship is like a plant. You have to water it every day for it to grow strong. Then I'll water our friendship every day, Laura declared, resolute. Edward walked Michael to the door. Before letting him go, he placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Thank you, Michael. You have no idea how much your presence meant today. Michael smiled, that smile that seemed to light up everything around him. It was the best party I've ever been to, Mr. Miller. Even without being invited at first, it was still the best. You're always welcome here, Michael. Always, Edward said, and for the first time in a long time, he truly meant it. After Michael left, heading down the steep street toward the housing project, Edward went back inside and found Laura in her room, holding the picture frame the boy had made. She looked up at her father with a sparkle in her eyes he hadn't seen in years. Today was the best birthday of my life, Daddy, she said. Not because of a big party or lots of presents, but because I made a real friend, a friend who sees me for who I am, not as the girl in the wheelchair. Edward knelt beside the chair and hugged his daughter, feeling the tears finally stream down his face. You're right, my princess, you're absolutely right. And I promise we're going to make this friendship something special. We'll take care of it, water it, just like Michael said. That night, after Laura fell asleep clutching the picture frame, Edward stood at his own bedroom window, looking out at the city spread below. He could see the lights of the housing project where Michael lived. He thought of the simplicity of the small apartment the boy had described, full of love and homemade chili. He thought of his own mansion with all its empty, echoing square footage, and for the first time in 3 years, since the accident that had changed everything, Edward allowed himself to question if he was living his life the right way, if he was giving Laura what she truly needed, if he was being the father she deserved. A seed had been planted that day, small, fragile, but vibrant with possibilities. Edward didn't know it yet, but that afternoon had marked the beginning of a transformation that would change not only his life and Laura's, but the lives of everyone around them. Because sometimes, all it takes is opening the door to a stranger with a pure heart for the entire carefully constructed framework of our existence to begin to crumble, making way for something new, something true, something truly worthwhile. And as night fell over the city, in 2 homes, one at the top of the hill and one at the base, Two children dreamed of space adventures, of true friendship, of a world where wheelchairs were spaceships and differences were just unimportant details. And a powerful man accustomed to controlling empires and making decisions that affected thousands of lives found himself completely lost, unsure of which way to turn, but for the first time in a long time willing to learn. The days following the birthday party brought a subtle but profound change to the routine at the Miller mansion. Michael started showing up regularly, always in the late afternoon after he finished his schoolwork. He would walk up the hill, a nearly 20-minute journey under the hot sun, but he always arrived smiling, his cheeks flushed from the effort and his eyes shining with anticipation. Edward watched, fascinated as this simple presence transformed everything around them. The mansion that once felt like a silent mausoleum now echoed with laughter, games, and lively conversations. Laura was different. She woke up earlier, chose her clothes with care, and did her physical therapy exercises with renewed enthusiasm because she wanted to be stronger for the adventures she and Michael invented. Susan remarked that she hadn't seen the girl so alive since before the accident, and her words carried a mix of joy and melancholy, like someone witnessing a small but significant miracle. Michael never arrived empty-handed. Sometimes he brought drawings he had made in class, always featuring superheroes, spaceships, or friendly dragons. Other times, he brought stories his grandmother told him, tales of kindness, courage, and true friendship. One afternoon, he showed up with a complex origami bird he had learned to make at a free workshop at the community center. He taught Laura how to fold the paper, guiding her small hands with infinite patience until she could create her own paper bird. They hung their creations in Laura's room, turning the ceiling into a private sky of colorful birds that seemed to fly in formation. Edward started coming home from work earlier. He cancelled meetings, delegated tasks he once considered irreplaceable, all to be present for those moments. He would sit discreetly in a corner of the room, pretending to read reports, but in reality, he was watching the two children play. Michael had a natural gift for adapting games to Laura's physical limitations without ever making her feel inferior. When they played board games, he positioned the pieces so Laura could easily reach them. When they created stories, the wheelchair always had a central role in the narrative, transformed into a throne, a magical vehicle, or a secret base of operations. But what impressed Edward most was how Michael handled the difficult moments. One afternoon, Laura had a bout of back pain, something that happened occasionally due to her prolonged posture in the chair. Tears streamed down her face, and Edward felt that familiar helplessness grip his chest. He never knew how to handle his daughter's pain. He would call doctors, adjust medications, but he never knew what to say, how to comfort her. Michael, however, simply pulled a chair close to Laura, held her hand, and began to tell a story. It wasn't just any story, but a tale about a warrior princess who faced dragons with courage even when everything hurt, because she knew that after the storm always came the rainbow. Michael's voice was soft and rhythmic, and gradually Laura began to relax, her breathing returning to normal, her tense muscles loosening. When the pain subsided, she was almost asleep, and Michael stayed there holding her hand until she woke up. Edward was deeply touched. This 9-year-old boy possessed an emotional wisdom that many adults never develop. And he began to wonder where it came from. What did Michael's family have that his own family had lost? What could he learn from these simple people living in a small apartment in the housing project? It was with this thought that Edward decided, 2 weeks after the party, to visit Michael's family. He didn't call ahead, fearing they might refuse or prepare in an artificial way. He wanted to see their reality, not an edited version designed to impress the rich businessman from the hill. It was a sunny Saturday when Edward drove down the hill, Laura in the back seat, the wheelchair folded in the trunk. Susan accompanied them, carrying a gift basket she had insisted on preparing, filled with imported fruits, fine chocolates, and an expensive bottle of wine. Edward had agreed to the basket, though he suspected the gifts might create more discomfort than gratitude. The housing project looked very different up close. The 5-story buildings had peeling paint in some spots, but there were flower pots on the balconies, children playing in the central courtyard, and elderly women chatting on plastic chairs under the shade of a leafy tree. There was life here, movement, the sounds of humanity. Edward parked his imported car, noticing the curious glances it attracted, and helped Susan get Laura settled in her chair. "Third floor, fourth door," Edward murmured, recalling the directions he had asked Michael for the day before. The elevator was broken, according to a handwritten sign taped to the door, so they took the stairs. Edward carried Laura in his arms, while Susan carried the disassembled chair. It wasn't the first time he'd done this, but climbing 3 flights with his daughter in his arms left him breathless, reminding him that he spent too much time sitting in offices and not enough time taking care of himself. The apartment door was slightly ajar, and Edward could hear voices inside, soft radio music and the unmistakable smell of home cooking. He knocked lightly, and seconds later Michael appeared, his face lighting up when he saw them. "Laura, Mr. Miller, you came." The boy opened the door completely, and Edward got his first look inside the apartment. It was small, very small. The living room and kitchen were practically one room, separated only by a low counter. The furniture was simple, some of it clearly old, but everything was impeccably clean and organized. The walls were adorned with family photos in cheap but neatly arranged frames. There were hand-sewn curtains, pillows with delicate embroidery, a worn-out sofa covered with a colorful blanket that hid the tears, and everywhere there were touches of care. Plants in painted chocolate milk cans, a patchwork rug on the floor, books stacked neatly on a makeshift shelf made from fruit crates. An elderly woman emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a floral apron. Edward knew at once it was Michael's grandmother. She had grey hair tied in a bun, dark eyes that radiated kindness, and a smile that lit up her entire wrinkled face. She was thin and short, but there was a dignity in her posture that immediately commanded respect. "Welcome," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm Helen, Michael's grandmother. What a joy to have you in our home. Please come in, make yourselves comfortable." Edward entered carrying Laura, and Susan followed with the chair and the basket. He suddenly felt awkward, as if he were intruding on a sacred space. Helen took the basket from Susan's hands with a gentle smile, but Edward noticed a slight discomfort in her eyes as she saw the extravagance of the gifts. "You shouldn't have," Helen said, "but we appreciate the kindness. Please sit down, I was just making lunch. Let me get James and Maria." She disappeared down a narrow hallway, and moments later 2 adults entered the room. Michael's father, James, was a tall, strong man with sun-weathered skin and large, calloused hands from hard work. He wore a simple t-shirt and jeans, and his handshake was firm but gentle. Maria, the mother, was a woman with a shy smile and kind eyes, wearing a simple cotton dress and flip-flops. There were traces of fatigue on her face, but also a serenity that Edward rarely saw in the people he knew. "It's an honor to have you," James said, his voice holding the sincerity of someone who knows no falsehood. "Michael never stops talking about you, about Laura especially. He says she's the bravest girl he knows." Laura blushed, smiling. "Michael's the special one. He's my best friend." The initial conversation was a bit tense, with both sides clearly trying to find common ground, but gradually the atmosphere warmed. Helen served freshly brewed coffee with homemade cornbread that melted in your mouth. Edward, accustomed to imported espressos and croissants from French bakeries, discovered he had never tasted anything as good as that cornbread made with love in a tiny kitchen. Michael took Laura to see his room, a space he shared with his parents. A curtain divided the area, creating a little corner for him with a single bed, a shelf full of books from the public library, and drawings taped to the walls. Laura was enchanted by the collection of paper superheroes Michael had made, figures cut from magazines and reinforced with cardboard. While the children played, Edward sat in the living room talking with James, Maria, and Helen. And it was in this conversation that he began to understand where Michael's wisdom came from. James told him about his routine as a bus driver, waking up at 4 every morning, driving through the chaotic city streets, dealing with traffic, stressed passengers, and grueling shifts. But he spoke with pride about his work, about the dignity of serving the city, of meeting people from all walks of life. Maria shared stories about her job as a cafeteria worker in a public school, serving lunch to hundreds of underprivileged children, for many of whom it was their only decent meal of the day. She spoke with tenderness about the children, about how she learned from their innocence, their ability to find joy in the smallest things. But it was Helen who touched Edward the most. She told him about her life, about raising 4 children alone after her husband left her, about working as a cleaner, a laundress, a cook, anything to pay the bills, about studying at night to finish high school at 50, an achievement she was immensely proud of, and about teaching her children, and now her grandson, that wealth isn't measured in money, but in character, in kindness, in the ability to love and be loved. "My husband, God rest his soul, was a doctor," Helen said, and Edward noticed a change in her voice, something between pride and melancholy. His name was Anthony. He spent his whole life researching ways to make heart medications affordable for poor children. He was passionate about that cause. He used to say that every child deserved a chance to grow up with a healthy heart, regardless of how many zeros their parents had in their bank account. Edward felt something shift inside him. He worked with medicine, ran one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the country, but he had never thought in those terms. To him, drugs were products, lines on a spreadsheet, profit margins, market strategies. He knew intellectually that they saved lives, but he had lost the human connection to what that truly meant. Anthony spent years developing a research project, Helen continued, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. A formula for a children's heart medication that would be cheap to produce but effective. He wanted to patent it and donate it to a non-profit to produce for free, but he passed away before he could finish. A sudden heart attack. The irony wasn't lost on me. A heart disease researcher dying of a heart attack. She paused, discreetly wiping her eyes. He left all his studies, his notes packed away in boxes. I never knew what to do with them. I don't have the scientific knowledge to know if it was truly revolutionary or just the dream of an idealist. Edward was frozen. There was something profoundly important in this story, something he couldn't quite process yet. Research on affordable children's heart medication, exactly the kind of thing his company should be doing, but wasn't, because it wasn't profitable enough. The conversation was interrupted by laughter from the bedroom. Michael and Laura had created a shadow, puppet theatre using a flashlight in their hands, projecting figures onto the wall. Edward and the others went to watch and found the 2 children completely absorbed in a story about a knight and a princess who save a kingdom from a dragon who, in the end, was just a lonely dragon who needed friends. Lunch was served at the small kitchen table. Helen had prepared a simple but delicious feast: fluffy rice, perfectly seasoned chili, roasted chicken with herbs, fresh salad, and crispy cornbread. Edward ate more than he had in months, surprised by the genuine taste of food, made with care. At the mansion, he had a private chef who prepared sophisticated dishes with imported ingredients, but nothing compared to the simplicity of this meal shared at a cramped table where everyone touched. During lunch, Helen told stories of Michael's childhood, of how he had always been an empathetic child concerned about others. She recalled the day when he was 5 and came home from school barefoot because he had given his sneakers to a classmate who didn't have any. Or the time he used his entire allowance to buy colored pencils for a new girl at school, who had no supplies. James and Maria listened with clear pride in their eyes, and Edward understood that this exceptional child was the result of an upbringing based on solid values and unconditional love. After lunch, while Helen and Maria washed the dishes, politely refusing Susan's help, Edward stood on the tiny apartment balcony with James. From there they could see the mansion at the top of the hill, standing out against the sky. "Must be different living up there," James commented, with no envy in his voice, just genuine curiosity. "So much peace, so much space." "It's different," Edward agreed, "but not necessarily better. You have something down here that I lost a long time ago. You have connection, you have presence, you have a love that doesn't depend on anything but yourselves." James smiled, the kind of smile that comes from knowing simple but profound truths. "Money is important, Mr. Miller. I won't pretend it's not. I know what it's like to struggle, to see your mother work herself to the bone, to worry about bills. But I also know that money never built bonds. Only time, patience, and love can do that. Edward looked at the mansion, seeing it with new eyes. Suddenly it seemed less imposing and more empty, a symbol of professional achievements that hadn't translated into personal happiness. He had climbed every rung of the corporate ladder, but somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of what truly mattered. When it was time to leave, Laura didn't want to go. She and Michael had become inseparable during those few hours, and the promise of seeing each other the next day seemed too far away. Helen hugged Laura tenderly, treating the wheelchair as a natural part of the girl, without discomfort or excessive pity. "You are always welcome here, my dear," Helen said. "Our home is small, but our heart is big enough for everyone who wants to come in." On the way back to the mansion, Edward drove in silence, processing everything he had seen and heard. Laura, in the back seat, chatted excitedly with Susan about how cozy Michael's house was, how delicious Mrs. Helen's food was, and how she wanted to learn to make cornbread too. When they arrived home, the mansion seemed even more empty and cold than before. Edward walked through the immense rooms, the echoing hallways, the impeccably manicured but sterile garden, and felt a void expanding in his chest. He had built all of this believing he was providing the best for Laura, that he was honoring the memory of how things were supposed to be. But maybe he had been wrong about what the best meant. That night, after Laura was asleep, Edward went to his office and sat at his mahogany desk. He looked at the framed awards on the walls, certificates of business excellence, photos of him shaking hands with politicians and celebrities, and he wondered what it all really meant. What was he building? For whom? For what? He thought about Dr. Anthony's research, forgotten in boxes in a corner of that small apartment. He thought about Helen, working her whole life in humble jobs, but maintaining her dignity and kindness. He thought about James and Maria, waking up before dawn for grueling work, but coming home with enough love to raise an extraordinary child like Michael. And he thought about himself, a man who had everything but felt hollow inside. He picked up the phone and dialed the number for Marcus, his vice president of research and development. It was late, but Marcus always answered, dedicated to his work to the point of obsession. "Marcus, I need you to do something for me," Edward said when the other man picked up. "There's some old research on children's heart medication that might have scientific value. It belonged to a doctor named Anthony Santos. I want you to use your contacts, check the university archives, the hospitals where he worked, find this research and evaluate its potential." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sir, with all due respect, old research is rarely viable. Science moves too fast." "Even so," Edward insisted, "do this for me, and Marcus, be discreet. I don't want this to become a board matter just yet." After hanging up, Edward returned to the window, looking at the lights of the housing project below. Something was changing inside him, something deep and irreversible. Michael had opened a door that Edward hadn't even known was locked, and on the other side of that door was a whole world of possibilities he had never considered. Edward's life had always been governed by numbers, profits, percentage growth, stock value. But for the first time he was beginning to understand that there were more important metrics. Metrics that didn't appear in quarterly reports, but defined the true success of a life. How much love did you give? How many lives did you touch? What legacy of kindness did you leave behind? Michael, with his 9 years and his gigantic heart, was teaching a 42-year-old businessman lessons that no business school could ever teach. And Edward, for the first time in a long time, was willing to learn, to change, to become something better than he was. The path ahead was still unclear, full of uncertainties, but he knew he had to walk it. Because sometimes to find what truly matters, we have to come down from the top of the hill and learn from those who live at the base, where life is harder but also more real, where love isn't an abstraction but a daily necessity, where kindness isn't a strategy but a means of survival. And Edward was finally ready to make that descent, even without knowing exactly where it would lead him. 3 weeks had passed since Edward's visit to the housing project, and life had settled into a new rhythm. Michael continued to show up every day, transforming the mansion into a vibrant space full of life. Laura was happier than Edward had seen her in years, and he himself was beginning to feel an internal shift, as if waking from a deep, numb sleep. Marcus had found Dr. Anthony's research in the archives of Columbia University. It consisted of 6 boxes, filled with handwritten notebooks, graphs, test results, and chemical formulas scribbled in the margins. The head of R&D at Miller Pharmaceuticals had spent 2 weeks analyzing the material with his team, and on that Thursday morning he called Edward for an urgent meeting. Edward entered the conference room expecting bad news, prepared to hear that the research was obsolete, unfeasible, just the romantic dream of an idealist. But the expression on Marcus's face was completely different from what he anticipated. There was excitement there, that gleam in the eye that scientists get when they discover something truly special. "Mr. Miller," Marcus began, opening a folder full of documents. "This research is extraordinary. Dr. Santos was decades ahead of his time. He identified a combination of compounds that, when synthesized in a specific way, could treat pediatric heart conditions with efficacy comparable to current medications, but at a drastically lower production cost." Edward sat down, his heart racing. "Go on." "We've run preliminary simulations. If we can synthesize this formula on an industrial scale, we could produce the drug for less than 20% of the current cost of available treatments. That would mean making it accessible to populations that today simply don't have access to proper treatment." "And it works? Is the formula viable?" "We would need full clinical trials, of course," Marcus admitted. "But based on the data Dr. Santos collected, the chemical properties of the compounds, and the scientific literature that has emerged since then confirming his premises, I believe we have something genuinely revolutionary here. Something that could save thousands of lives." Edward leaned back in his chair, the weight of this information crashing down on him. In his hands, he had something that could radically change access to healthcare for underprivileged children. But he also knew his company, knew the board of directors, knew the relentless logic of the pharmaceutical market. Cheap drugs didn't generate the astronomical profits that shareholders expected. Research for diseases that primarily affected poor populations was considered a bad investment. "How much would it cost to bring this to market?" Edward asked. "With the infrastructure we already have, leveraging existing facilities, maybe 15 million initially for clinical trials, plus another 20 million to scale up production. It's a significant investment, but compared to other projects we're running, it's modest." Edward did some quick mental math. 35 million was a fraction of Miller Pharmaceuticals' annual research budget. They spent more than that developing cosmetic variations of existing drugs just to extend patents and maintain profit margins. But he also knew the board would never approve an investment in something that didn't promise stratospheric returns. "Prepare a full presentation," Edward instructed. "I want all the data, all the projections, everything we need to justify this project. I'm taking it to the board." Marcus hesitated. "Sir, with all due respect, the board has systematically rejected any proposal that doesn't meet the established profitability targets, and this project, as noble as it is, won't generate the returns they expect. At best, it would be financially neutral." "I know," Edward replied, a new determination in his voice, "but I'm going to try anyway. Prepare the presentation." That afternoon, Edward went home early, his mind buzzing with possibilities and strategies. He found Laura and Michael in the garden, engrossed in an elaborate treasure hunt that Michael had organized. They had scattered clues around the property, and Laura was commanding the expedition from her chair, giving instructions like a captain navigating uncharted seas. Edward watched for a moment, smiling at the sight of his daughter so engaged, so alive. And then he had an idea. He called Michael over discreetly, asking to speak with him in private. "Michael, I need to ask you something," Edward began, kneeling to be at the boy's eye level. "Those research boxes of your grandfather's that your grandmother keeps, do you think she would lend them to me for a while? There's something important I need to do with them." Michael's eyes shone with curiosity and a touch of pride. "Of course, Mr. Miller. My grandma always says Grandpa's work should be helping people, not collecting dust. She'd be happy to know someone is interested." Edward thanked him and arranged to pick up the materials over the weekend. But fate had other plans. The next morning, a Friday that promised to be ordinary, everything changed in a matter of minutes. Edward was in a meeting with investors when his cell phone vibrated insistently. He ignored the first few calls, But when he saw 5 missed calls in a row from James, a chill ran down his spine. Something was wrong. "Excuse me," he said to the investors. "I have to take this. It's an emergency." He stepped out of the conference room and returned the call. James's voice on the other end was tense, laden with barely contained panic. "Mr. Miller, it's my mother, Helen. She collapsed at home. We're at City General Hospital. The doctors say it's her heart. It's serious." Edward felt the ground shake beneath his feet. "I'm on my way." He cancelled all his meetings for the day, got in his car, and drove to the hospital at a dangerous speed. City General was crowded as always, hallways filled with waiting people, the strong smell of disinfectant, that heavy atmosphere of suffering and hope mixed together. He found James and Maria in the cardiology waiting room, both with devastated expressions of worry. "How is she?" Edward asked, placing a supportive hand on James's shoulder. "Stable for now, but the doctors said she had a severe cardiac arrhythmia. Her heart is very weak." James ran, a hand over his face, trying to contain his emotions. "They need to run more detailed tests, but they've already mentioned long-term medication, possibly surgery in the future." A young doctor approached, wearing a white coat and carrying a clipboard. She introduced herself as Dr. Anna Reed, the cardiologist in charge of the case. "Mrs. Helen's situation requires immediate treatment," she explained, her tone professional but not insensitive. "She has advanced dilated cardiomyopathy. We need to start a specific medication protocol to stabilize her heart function and prevent future episodes." "What medication?" Edward asked, though a part of him already knew the answer. Dr. Reed consulted her clipboard. "CardioMax Plus. It's the most effective for her condition. Unfortunately, it's a high-cost drug, not fully covered by most insurance plans. The monthly treatment would be around $3,000. Edward saw James's face turn pale. $3,000 was probably half his salary, maybe more. With rent, bills and food, there was no way they could afford that cost every month. "CardioMax Plus," Edward said slowly, "is produced by my company, by Miller Pharmaceuticals." A heavy silence fell. James and Maria looked at Edward with a mixture of hope and embarrassment. Dr. Reed raised her eyebrows in surprise. "In that case, perhaps you can help," she said carefully. "This is exactly the kind of situation where access to medication becomes a matter of life and death." Edward felt the weight of multiple ironies crashing down on him like hammers. He controlled the company that produced the drug that could save the life of the woman who had shown him the true meaning of kindness. The same company that charged prices that made that drug inaccessible to people like Helen. The same company that rejected research that could create cheaper alternatives because they didn't generate enough profit. "I'll take care of it," Edward said, his voice firm. "Mrs. Helen will have all the necessary treatment at no cost to the family. I'll arrange it personally." "Mr. Miller," James began, clearly uncomfortable, "we can't accept charity." "It's not charity," Edward interrupted. "It's the least I can do for a woman who has been so important to my daughter and to me. And besides," he added, looking directly into James's eyes, "it's the right thing to do." In the weeks that followed, as Helen slowly recovered at home with the treatment provided by Edward, something inside him began to boil. He saw the numbers in the company's reports, and they took on a new meaning. Every percentage of increased profit meant families who couldn't afford medicine. Every fat bonus distributed to executives meant people dying for lack of access to treatment. Edward started asking uncomfortable questions in meetings. He questioned why CardioMax Plus cost so much when its production costs were a fraction of the selling price. He asked why they didn't invest in drugs for neglected diseases that affected millions of poor people. He challenged the logic of spending fortunes on marketing drugs for erectile dysfunction while children were dying for lack of basic antibiotics. The answers were always the same: fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders, the need to maintain competitive margins, the reality of the pharmaceutical market, empty words that tried to justify the unjustifiable. It was then that Edward made the most radical decision of his professional life. He called an extraordinary meeting of the Miller Pharmaceuticals Board of Directors, scheduled for a rainy Monday in November. He spent the weekend preparing a presentation that he knew would be met with shock, anger, and fierce resistance. On the morning of the meeting, Edward arrived early at the company's headquarters, a glass and steel building in the heart of Midtown Manhattan. The boardroom was imposing, with a massive rosewood table, Italian leather chairs, and state-of-the-art presentation screens. 12 board members were present, men and women in impeccable suits, with multi-million-dollar portfolios and expressions of people accustomed to running empires. Edward began his presentation by showing the usual numbers. Profits were up, international expansion was successful, new products were in the pipeline. The board listened with approval, nodding in satisfaction. But then he changed course. "However," Edward began, his voice echoing through the room, "I want to propose a fundamental change in the direction of this company. I want us to rethink our mission, our values, our purpose." He projected Dr. Anthony's research on the screen, explained its revolutionary potential, and showed Marcus's projections. He spoke of the millions of children who could have access to heart treatment if the drug were developed and offered at affordable prices. The room was silent, but Edward could feel the tension building, and then he dropped what he knew would be the bombshell. "I propose that Miller Pharmaceuticals invest $35 million in the development of this drug. More than that, I propose that we reduce the prices of our essential medicines by 40%, making them accessible to low-income populations. I propose the creation of a social fund to provide free medication to those who cannot pay. And I propose that we redirect 20% of our marketing budget to research on neglected diseases." The explosion of reactions was immediate. Robert Evans, the main minority shareholder, a 60-year-old man with a perpetually annoyed expression, was the first to speak. "Edward, have you completely lost your mind? This would be corporate suicide. Our profits would plummet. Our stock would crash. We'd be swallowed by the competition." Other board members joined the chorus of objections. Helen Anderson, representing institutional investors, spoke of legal responsibilities to shareholders. Charles Davis, from the finance department, presented catastrophic projections of losses. Frank Lewis, a veteran of the pharmaceutical industry, called the proposal naive and irresponsible. Edward let them speak, absorbing every criticism, every argument, every attack. And then, when the storm momentarily subsided, he responded. "You're right," he said, surprising everyone. "From a purely financial standpoint, this proposal would reduce our short-term profits. But I ask you, what is a company for? To enrich a handful of executives and investors, or to fulfill a purpose that goes beyond the numbers on a quarterly balance sheet?" He walked to the window, looking out at the city below, at the millions of people struggling to survive, many of them without access to the medicines his company produced. "I recently met a family," Edward continued, "a humble family living in a small apartment who work hard every day for modest wages. And they taught me something that all the business schools I attended, all the leadership seminars I participated in, could never teach me. They taught me that real value isn't measured in zeros in a bank account, but in the positive impact we have on the lives of others." "That's very nice, Edward," Robert interrupted, his tone dismissive. "But we are not a non-profit. We are a company with financial responsibilities." "And what if I told you," Edward replied, his voice lowering but carrying weight, "that we can have both, that we can be profitable and ethical, that we can grow and help people? Studies show that companies with a strong social commitment often outperform their competitors in the long run. They build brand loyalty, attract the best talent, and earn public respect." He projected new slides, showing examples of companies that had adopted socially responsible models and thrived. But he could see in the faces around the table that most were not convinced. To them, this was dangerous idealism, a fantasy that threatened established fortunes. The vote was called. Edward's proposal to transform the company's direction needed a 2/3 majority to pass. The result was overwhelming. 10 votes against, only 2 in favor. The proposal was rejected, but Edward didn't give up. Over the following weeks, he continued to press, scheduling individual meetings with each board member, trying to convince them one by one. He began to be seen as a troublemaker, too idealistic, losing touch with business reality. Robert Evans began a quiet but effective campaign to undermine him. Hallway conversations, emails circulating among board members, articles planted in financial blogs questioning Edward's leadership. There were whispers that perhaps it was time to replace him, to bring in someone more focused on financial results, less distracted by social issues. Edward felt the ground disappearing from under his feet. He had built this company from the ground up, transforming it from a modest regional operation into a national powerhouse. But now, for the first time, he faced the real possibility of losing it, not due to incompetence or market failure, but for daring to suggest that money shouldn't be the only goal. At home, he shared his frustrations with Laura over dinner. The girl, now 8 but with a wisdom beyond her years, listened intently as her father spoke of ethical dilemmas, corporate responsibilities, and the price of having a conscience in a world governed by profit. "Daddy," Laura said when he finished, "remember that story Michael told me about his grandma teaching that we should plant flowers of kindness, even if we're not here to see them grow?" Edward nodded, curious where his daughter was going with this. "I think you're planting flowers, Daddy, and maybe people can't see them yet, but one day they'll grow and everyone will be able to enjoy them, even if you're not there to see it." Those words, spoken with the pure sincerity of a child, touched Edward deeply. He realized his daughter had learned lessons from Michael that he himself was still struggling to internalize, and he decided that no matter the personal cost, he would continue to fight for what was right. But the board was not willing to wait for flowers to grow. In an emergency meeting called for a Friday afternoon, Robert presented a motion of no confidence against Edward. He cited a lack of focus, questionable decisions, and compromising the company's profitability. The vote was scheduled for the following week. Edward left that meeting knowing he was about to lose everything: his position, his company, the empire he had built, and part of him wondered if it was really worth it, if one man alone could truly make a difference against such an entrenched system. That evening he visited Helen in her apartment. The elderly woman was recovering well with the treatment, sitting in her favorite armchair, knitting a colorful scarf. When Edward told her about his situation, about the battle he was fighting and about to lose, she stopped knitting and looked at him with those deep eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface. "My husband used to say," Helen said, her voice soft but firm, "that doing the right thing is rarely easy, and it often comes at a cost. But the cost of not doing the right thing is always greater, even if we only realize it later." She took Edward's hand in hers, calloused and warm. "You are doing what Anthony would have done. You are honoring his dream. And no matter what happens, that has value. It always has value." Edward left with a heavy but determined heart. The final battle was coming, and he didn't know if he would win. But he knew he had to fight, because some things are worth more than profits and corporate positions. Some things are worth everything. The Monday morning that would decide Edward's fate dawned, grey and overcast, with heavy clouds that threatened rain but hesitated to fall. Edward woke early after a night of restless sleep, filled with fragmented dreams and sudden awakenings. He put on his best suit, a finely tailored armor of fabric. Though he knew it would make no difference, this wasn't about appearances but principles, and he had learned that principles are rarely popular in the business world. Before leaving, he stopped by Laura's room. The girl was awake, sitting up in bed with several books spread around her, studying for a test. When she saw her father at the door, her face lit up, but there was concern in her eyes. She knew what this day meant. "Everything will be okay, Daddy," she said, with the certainty only children can possess. "You're doing the right thing. The right thing always wins in the end." Edward went in and kissed his daughter's forehead, holding on to that moment, that pure faith. "I hope you're right, my princess. I really do." The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock. Edward arrived half an hour early, finding the boardroom already prepared, with mineral water and coffee set out on side tables, the large screen ready for presentations. Slowly the board members arrived, their faces carefully neutral, some avoiding Edward's gaze, others greeting him with the cold cordiality of those who know they are about to perform an execution. Robert Evans arrived last, carrying a bulky folder and a poorly concealed expression of satisfaction. He had rehearsed this moment, prepared every argument, gathered every piece of evidence to prove that Edward had lost focus, compromised the company, and betrayed the shareholders' trust. The meeting began with procedural formalities, minutes from the previous meeting, minor administrative issues, the kind of bureaucracy that precedes major events. And then, Robert asked for the floor. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, rising to speak as if in a courtroom, "we are here to discuss something extremely serious. The leadership of this company, which we have built together over decades, is being compromised by questionable decisions and a radical, unsolicited change in direction." He began to list them. The meetings where Edward had questioned established pricing policies, the proposals he had made without prior consultation with the board, his personal involvement with a low-income family that had, in Robert's words, compromised his professional objectivity, and finally, the radical proposal to reorient the entire company based on sentimentality rather than concrete market data. "Edward," Robert said, turning to face him directly, "we respect your contributions to this company, but it is clear that you have lost the perspective necessary to lead it. Therefore, I formally present a motion for your removal from the position of CEO, effective immediately." The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. Edward looked around the table, studying each face, each expression. There was discomfort, no doubt. Some members were clearly conflicted, but there was also determination. The business world had no room for conscience, or so they believed. Edward was about to stand up to make his defense when he heard a noise at the door. Everyone turned to see what it was, and what they saw left the room momentarily stunned. Michael stood in the doorway, wearing his best clothes, a slightly oversized dress shirt that was probably his father's, neatly pressed school pants, and polished shoes that shone under the fluorescent lights. Beside him, in her wheelchair, was Laura, dressed in a pretty dress and a blazer that made her look older, more serious. Behind them, Susan held a few boxes, and next to her stood Dr. Anna Reed, the cardiologist from the hospital. "Sorry to interrupt," Michael said, his voice trembling slightly but surprisingly firm, "but my name is Michael Santos, and this is my friend Laura. We came to talk about my grandfather, Dr. Anthony Santos." "What is this, Edward?" Robert exploded, clearly furious. "You brought children to a board meeting? This is outrageous." "I didn't bring anyone," Edward replied, equally surprised. "But I think we should hear what they have to say." Helen Anderson, always the most diplomatic member of the board, gestured for the visitors to enter. "All right, let's hear them out, but be brief." Michael entered, pushing Laura's chair, followed by Susan with the boxes and the doctor. Edward realized those were the boxes of Dr. Anthony's research. Marcus must have taken them to the hospital for Dr. Reed to examine, and somehow the children had found out about the meeting and decided to intervene. "My grandfather," Michael began, his voice stronger now, "dedicated his entire life to trying to help sick children. He wasn't rich, he didn't have fancy labs, but he had a big heart and a brilliant mind. He believed that every child deserved to live, no matter how much money their parents had." The boy paused, looking around the room, his eyes briefly meeting those of each board member. Edward saw some of them look away, uncomfortable under that innocent yet piercing scrutiny. "My grandmother almost died a few weeks ago," Michael continued. "She needed a medicine our family couldn't afford, but Mr. Miller, he helped. He gave her the medicine for free, even though he barely knew us, and you know why? Because he understood something my grandfather always said, that saving lives isn't a business, it's a duty." The words hung in the air, simple, but devastating in their truth. Robert started to protest, but Helen silenced him with a gesture. Dr. Reed stepped forward. "If I may, I'd like to add something from a medical perspective." She opened the folder she was carrying. "I've spent the last 2 weeks reviewing Dr. Santos's research with a team of specialists. What this man developed is genuinely revolutionary. With the proper trials, this medication could transform pediatric cardiac care, making it accessible to millions of children who currently have no options. But the issue isn't just scientific," she continued. "It's ethical. As a doctor, I see families devastated every day because they can't afford the treatments their children need. I see children who could be saved, but aren't, not for lack of medical knowledge, but for lack of access. And when a company has the power to change that, it also has the moral responsibility to do so. Robert was visibly irritated now. With all due respect, Doctor, we are not a charity. We have shareholders, legal obligations. It was then that Laura spoke, her voice clear and firm. Before my accident, I had a lot of friends, or at least I thought I did. But when I ended up in a wheelchair, they all disappeared. They had excuses, they always did. But the truth is they stayed away because I was different, because I needed special care, because it wasn't convenient to be my friend. She paused, looking directly at Robert. But Michael, he showed up when no one else did. He didn't care about my chair, he just saw a girl who needed a friend. And you know what my dad has taught me since then? That the true worth of a person or a company isn't in how much it earns, but in how much it cares. Edward felt tears burning his eyes. His 8-year-old daughter was giving a lesson in ethics to men and women in their 40s, 50s and 60s, people who had built fortunes but forgotten how to be human. Michael took another step forward. My grandma always says something. She says we should plant flowers of kindness, even if we're not here to see them grow. My grandfather planted those flowers. He worked for years and years on research that wasn't going to make him rich, but that would help a lot of people. And he died before he could finish. But the flowers are still here in these boxes, waiting for someone brave enough to make them grow. The boy looked at Edward, and there was pride in his gaze. Mr. Miller, he has that courage. He's willing to lose everything to do the right thing. And you? Michael's gaze swept the room. Are you going to let him do it alone? Or are you going to help plant flowers too? The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer a silence of tension or discomfort, but of deep reflection. Edward saw something change in the expressions around the table. Helen's eyes were misty. Charles Davis was visibly shaken. Even Robert seemed to have lost some of his belligerent arrogance. Helen was the first to speak. I have a granddaughter. She's 5. Looking at Laura now, I wonder what kind of world we're building for them. A world where only the rich survive, where profit is worth more than lives. Charles joined her. I entered this industry 30 years ago because I wanted to help people. Somewhere along the way I forgot that. I lost sight of why I started. One by one, board members began to speak, sharing their own doubts, their internal conflicts between financial obligations and moral conscience. Not all of them changed their minds. Robert remained firm in his opposition, as did 2 other more conservative members. But something fundamental had shifted in the room's atmosphere. When it was finally time to vote, the result was different than expected. 7 votes to keep Edward as CEO and implement his proposals, 5 against. The margin was narrow, but it was enough. Edward felt his legs weaken with relief, but more than relief, he felt a profound gratitude, not just for keeping his job, but for witnessing something extraordinary. 2 children, with their innocence and moral clarity, had done what he alone could not. They had touched hearts hardened by greed. They had planted seeds of conscience in arid soil. Robert stormed out of the meeting, slamming the door. Some of the members who had voted against him also left quickly, clearly uncomfortable, but the others remained, approaching Michael and Laura, wanting to know more about the research, about Dr. Anthony's story, about how they could help. In the weeks that followed, Miller Pharmaceuticals underwent a radical transformation. Edward created an entire department dedicated to affordable medicines, with a generous budget and the autonomy to make decisions based on social impact rather than just profit. Dr. Anthony's research was officially acquired from the Santos family for a fair price, and clinical trials began immediately. The prices of essential medicines were progressively reduced, starting with a 20% cut, and with plans to decrease them further as the company optimized its operations. A social fund was established, providing free treatments to families with proven financial need, and the company began to invest heavily in neglected diseases that primarily affected poor populations. The reactions were mixed. Some market analysts criticized the changes, predicting a drop in stock prices and a loss of competitiveness. Some shareholders sold their stakes, dissatisfied with the new direction. Robert and other board members who had voted against him eventually resigned, unable to accept the transformation. But something surprising happened. The story of the change at Miller Pharmaceuticals went viral. Newspapers, websites, and television programs began to cover the transformation of a pharmaceutical company that had chosen people over profits. The company's public image improved dramatically. Consumers began to choose Miller's drugs specifically because of their ethical practices. Bright talents, especially young, idealistic researchers, started seeking out the company for work. And 6 months after that fateful meeting, something even more surprising occurred. Profits had not only held steady, but had increased. Brand loyalty, positive publicity, and reduced spending on aggressive marketing all contributed to a financial performance that stunned even the most die-hard skeptics. Edward was in his office one Friday afternoon when Marcus knocked on the door, carrying a folder full of documents. The preliminary results of the clinical trials for the drug, based on Dr. Anthony's research, were ready. "Mr. Miller," Marcus said, genuine emotion in his voice, "it worked. The drug not only works, it exceeds expectations. If we can get regulatory approval, and I see no reason why we won't, we'll be ready for mass production in 18 months. And the cost," he paused, smiling, "will be less than 15% of what current treatments charge." Edward closed his eyes, letting that information sink in. Thousands, perhaps millions of children would have access to treatment that was previously impossible. Dr. Anthony's dream, stored in boxes for years, would finally become a reality. That evening, Edward hosted a special dinner at the mansion. He invited Helen, James, Maria, and Michael. Susan prepared a feast, mixing the sophisticated dishes Edward appreciated with the homemade recipes she had learned from Helen. The large dining room table, which used to sit empty and imposing, was now full of life, laughter, and animated conversation. During dessert, Edward made a toast. "To 2 extraordinary children," he said, looking at Michael and Laura, "who taught me that courage has nothing to do with power or money, but with doing the right thing even when it's hard. And to Dr. Anthony," he raised his glass toward Helen, "whose legacy will continue to save lives for generations to come." Helen, with tears streaming down her wrinkled face, responded, "My Anthony always said that true success isn't what you accumulate for yourself, but what you leave behind that improves the world." She looked at Edward with deep gratitude. "You are making my husband proud. Wherever he is smiling." After dinner, while the adults chatted in the living room, Michael and Laura went to her room. They were sitting by the window, looking at the illuminated city below, when Michael pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "I made this for you," he said, handing it to Laura. "It's your certificate for being the best friend in the world." Laura unfolded the paper and saw an elaborate drawing, with borders decorated with stars and hearts, and in the center, written neatly, "Official Best Friend Certificate, awarded to Laura Miller for being brave, kind, and amazing. Signed, Michael Santos, Best Friend." She held the paper to her chest, smiling. "I'm going to keep this forever. Along with the picture frame you gave me for my birthday, I'm going to keep all the memories of how you changed my life." "I didn't change anything," Michael protested. "I just showed up at a party." "You showed up when no one else did," Laura corrected. "You saw me when everyone else just saw the chair. You were my friend when I thought I'd never have friends again. That changed everything." Michael smiled, that smile that lit up everything around him. "My grandma was right then, about the flowers of kindness. You plant them, and they grow in places you never even imagined." "They really do," Laura agreed. "And they'll keep growing. Because of your grandpa, my dad, all of us. We're going to leave a whole garden behind." 6 months after that dinner, Michael arrived at the mansion with his report card. He was ecstatic, practically jumping for joy. Straight A's in every subject, especially science. He showed it to Laura with pride. "I'm going to be a scientist," he declared, "like my grandpa. I'm going to research things that help people. I'm going to make a difference in the world." "You're already making a difference," Laura said, smiling. "You've already changed the world. At least, you changed my world." Edward, watching the 2 children from the bedroom doorway, felt his heart overflow. He thought about everything. That had happened since that empty birthday party. how a simple boy, with his pure heart and unassuming presence, had catalyzed a transformation he never would have imagined possible. The company was flourishing in ways that went far beyond numbers on a balance sheet. They had become leaders, not only in pharmaceutical innovation, but in corporate social responsibility. Other companies were beginning to follow their example, realizing that ethics and profit were not mutually exclusive. The drug based on Dr. Anthony's research was in the final stages of approval, and projections indicated it could benefit over 500,000 children in its first year of distribution. But more than the numbers, more than the social responsibility awards that were starting to arrive, more than the glowing articles in the press, what mattered to Edward was what he saw in that moment. His daughter, who had endured so much suffering, so isolated and lonely, now laughed freely, confident and loved. And a boy who could have easily become just another poverty statistic now had limitless horizons, ambitious dreams, and his potential being nurtured. That night, after Michael went home and Laura was asleep, Edward stood once again at his bedroom window, looking out at the city. But this time he didn't feel the emptiness of before. He felt connection. He felt purpose. He felt that his life finally had a meaning that went beyond material achievements. He thought of a phrase Helen had shared with him, something Dr. Anthony used to say. A person's true legacy is not what they build for themselves, but what they leave for others. And Edward finally understood it on a deep, visceral level. His legacy wouldn't be the mansion on the hill or the company stock or the accumulated fortune. It would be Laura growing up strong and confident despite adversity. It would be Michael having every opportunity to realize his dreams. It would be every child who would receive treatment that was once inaccessible. It would be every family that wouldn't have to choose between buying food and buying medicine. It would be the transformation of an entire industry, one small step at a time. And it had all started with a simple choice. The choice to open the door to an unknown boy who showed up at a party. The choice to see beyond appearances, beyond social classes, beyond the barriers society builds. The choice to believe that kindness matters, that empathy has value, that doing the right thing is worth any cost. Edward smiled at the night sky, at the lights that twinkled like terrestrial stars, at the world full of challenges, but also infinite possibilities. And silently he made a promise, not just to himself but to Laura, to Michael, to Helen, to Dr. Anthony, to all the people whose lives he had the power to touch. He would keep planting flowers of kindness, every day in every way he could, because now he understood that this was the true purpose of having power, of having resources, of having opportunities. It wasn't to accumulate more, but to give more. It wasn't to build higher walls, but wider bridges. It wasn't to separate himself from the rest of humanity, but to connect more deeply with it. And maybe, just maybe, if all people with power made similar choices, the world could become the kind of garden everyone deserved to inhabit. A garden planted by many hands, cared for by many hearts, where flowers of kindness would grow in abundance for all. The transformation of a forgotten girl, a simple boy, and a lost father had become something much bigger. It had become a story about the transformative power of empathy, about the revolutionary force of inclusion, about the human capacity to choose kindness even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. And like all great stories, this one didn't really have an end. It was just a beginning, the beginning of gardens being planted in hearts around the world, the beginning of a new way of understanding success, the beginning of a reconnection with what truly matters in human existence, because in the end we are all part of the same story. Rich or poor, powerful or humble, in wheelchairs or on our feet, we all share the same fundamental need, the need to love and be loved, to matter and to make a difference, to plant flowers that will continue to grow long after we are gone, beautifying the world for those who come after. And that, Edward now knew with absolute certainty, was the only thing truly worth doing, the only thing that made a life truly lived, the only thing that, in the end, would really matter.